So, how did I get from there to here? When people find out that I used to be an Anglican priest, one of the first things they often want to know is, why did I leave? Why did I leave the priesthood? Why did I leave the church? Now, the answer to that question is quite long and complicated. So I usually give a fairly quick and glib answer. I don't really want to watch their eyes glaze over as the story grows and grows and gets more and more complicated. Luckily for you, I can't see your eyes, and I won't know whether they glaze over or not. So I thought I would take the opportunity to tell that story in some detail here, at least the important parts. Now, this will take a while, and I'll need to split this video into two parts. But I should warn you that some of what I have to say may be somewhat threatening to you. You may not like some of the things that I have to say and some of the conclusions that I came to. But I'm not saying it to upset you. I'm just wanting to tell you my story and where my journey's taken me over the years. I was born in England in 1957, and my family left England to migrate to Australia in 1966, and I was still 8 years old. Now, we never went to church. We had no religious affiliation or upbringing beyond the usual. I was baptized in the Anglican Church as a child, but we never attended church. The only time we did was maybe an occasional baptism or wedding. I don't remember having any religious education at school. If I did, it certainly left no impression on me. But later in life, when I became a teenager, maybe my mid-teenage years and a little bit later, as I suppose many teenagers do, I started asking questions, the big questions. What's it all about? Why are we here? The usual big stuff. Being the kind of person I was, I did a lot of reading. I read novels, I read some philosophical books, I dabbled a little bit in looking at religion, but I struggled to find what was meaningful to me. And for one period at least, I decided that I would definitely be an atheist. I remember reading a book by Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher, which was called Why I Am an Atheist. And I found that quite convincing. But my questions didn't entirely go away, and to some extent they were fueled by experiences that I had. Now, you might call these mystical experiences, and I guess I've had a tendency towards that for most of my life. When I was in year 12, one of the books that we read was a novel by Patrick White, the Australian Nobel Prize winning writer. And that book was called Riders in the Chariot. And I absolutely adored that book. It's pretty heavy going. It's a chunky book, and it's not an easy read, but I loved it. The characters in it, particularly I think four main characters, all had some kind of mystical experience. And I strongly identified with that. I thought these experiences were real. What they meant, I didn't really know, but I felt that they were real. For those of you who are struggling to understand what I mean, they're the kinds of experiences that you might get when you're listening to a piece of music that you really love and it seems to lift you out of yourself. Or perhaps it's another experience, perhaps encountering an artwork or a beautiful sunset. It's corny stuff, but it seemed to hint at something greater, something beyond me. That there was at least a me beyond me, if you like. I wasn't sure what that was all about. A French writer called Romain Rolland in the 1920s sometime coined a phrase, oceanic feeling, when he wrote a letter to Sigmund Freud. And he referred to it as a sensation of eternity, a feeling of being one with the extensive external world as a whole. And Freud himself discusses this feeling in a couple of his books, The Future of an Illusion and Civilization and Its Discontents. So I was having these experiences and I didn't understand them. So I did some more exploration. And eventually I found myself reading the Bible and drawn to Christian teachings. I suppose that's because they were more accessible to me. I had more of a context for understanding them. Many of the aspects of Christian teachings were part of the culture around me. We're talking about the 1970s here. I was much more familiar with those concepts, even if it was nothing more than, the Christmas story and the Easter story. I was much more familiar with those concepts than I was with anything from the Far East in, say, Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever. So I found myself drawn into that world and reading more and trying to understand it more. And I joined, at that stage, a Christian church. Now, in those days, in the Anglican Church and other mainline churches, there was a movement happening which was called the Charismatic Movement. Now, I don't know whether you've ever heard of that or experienced it at all. It drew its inspiration from the more fringe type churches, the Pentecostal churches, the revivalist churches, which began, I think, around the early 1900s. And it included experiences that you may have witnessed perhaps on television when you've seen a revivalist meetings from, the Deep South in America or something like that, because they originate in America largely. So there would be experiences like speaking in tongues. They'd be casting out demons. People would be falling to the ground in religious ecstasies. They'd be singing clap-along songs. So it was all happy, clappy stuff. And the Anglican church that I went to actually, at least many of the members, actually belonged to that charismatic movement. Now, at that stage in my life, I knew no different. As far as I knew, this was what the Christian church, or at least the Anglican church, looked like. So I went along with it. And, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fellowship there. I was pretty much a loner then, as I am now. But I did enjoy the interaction with people, the sense of belonging that you get when you join a group like that. A little later, I guess to cut a long story short, if you like, I actually decided that I wanted to go a bit further. That's me as well. I don't do things by half measure. So I decided I want to go a bit further, and I actually applied to go to theological college and become an Anglican priest. And you have to go through a whole process of selection for that. You can't just fill out a form and go along. There's a selection process, and I was selected after various interviews and processes. I think the Anglican Church, like many of the more established church, was quite keen to have a younger member and a younger person who wanted to go to theological college. I would have been, I suppose, 23 at the time that I went through that process. So I was accepted. The church was quite keen to accept me into that process. And so I went to theological college. And this was something of an awakening to me. This was actually a moment of liberation. Because while I was under the influence of the charismatic movement, this is tended towards a more fundamentalist view of the Bible and a more sort of immediately supernatural view of the world around you. So the Bible was to be believed as, the literal word of God, infallible. Not all that the Anglicans believed that, not even all of the charismatic Anglicans believed that. But among the younger crowd, there was a tendency to believe that. And also that, we were constantly being afflicted by demons, that we were constantly fighting off the devil, praying for each other to be rid of these demons. All of that stuff was going on. And although I didn't really realize it at the time, that was quite oppressive. It was also suppressive, because to accept all that, I had to suppress my own rationality. I've always been a very rational person. I've always thought things through. I've always thought very logically. But belonging to this movement meant that I had to suppress that. I had to accept things that my rational mind would reject if I let it take over. And that wasn't acceptable within that group, right? I mean, you were in danger of losing your faith if you started to question things. So you didn't question things. But when I went to theological college, to an Anglican theological college in Adelaide, that was an eye opener. It was a breath of fresh air. It was a process of liberation. And this was actually the first time that I experienced liberation. I didn't experience it when I became a Christian, particularly, but I did experience when I was taken out from under that heavy yoke of the charismatic kind of Pentecostal version of Christianity and taken into the more enlightened environment of the theological college. At last, I could think again. I was free to think again. In those days, the Anglican Church, and maybe it still is, but in those days, the Anglican Church was fairly liberal theologically, at least in Adelaide. We were not expected to believe that the Bible was absolutely true at every level. We were taught, in fact, that the Bible is an historical document written over many thousands of years by many different people from many different cultures. And to understand the Bible, you had to understand that historical background, that historical process. You had to learn about the context of the story that was being told, but also the context of the people who were telling that story, sometimes hundreds of years later. So it was a very historical critical and literary critical process with regards to the Bible. I didn't have to believe in Adam and Eve anymore. I didn't have to believe in the fall as a literal historical occurrence. I didn't have to believe in the flood and Noah. These I could now understand as stories that were meant to teach something. I was free to believe in evolution, which I always had done, although you couldn't really talk about that in the charismatic Pentecostal movement. I was free to believe in evolution. I was free to believe in the Big Bang. I didn't have to think the world was just a few thousand years old. So here I was in this environment of freedom. Once again, I could be a rational being. So I went through theological college. I lapped it up. I loved it. I loved the rigor of the intellectual discussions that we were having and the study that we were having. Eventually, I went out into the world and I became a priest, and I worked in parishes and I worked in chaplaincies and so on. And I also went further academically. I went on to do a PhD in theology. And during that time, and somewhat later also, I actually did some lecturing at university as well. And this was all good. It was all a good time for me. So I think that's enough for today. I think that's a good place to leave me. So I hope you'll join me tomorrow for the rest of this story.